On the last episode of unMakers, we explored the attack on traditional Texas history and the plan to bring new social history to Texas, how it was carried out successfully, and how the man with the plan is now chief historian of the Texas State Historical Association and holds an endowed chair in Texas history at UT. But Michelle, you say, people change, they grow. Maybe Walter Binger's views have mellowed with time. Let's look at what Chief Historian Binger's been up to since 1990 or so. From the Kerrville Times, June 13, 1989, the year before the new social history plan was published. A debate arose in Bryan about the naming of a new elementary school. The old school had been named for William Barrett Travis, and it was being torn down. It was proposed to name the new school after Dr. Mary Branch, a Black educator from Virginia who became Texas's first female college president, heading Houston Tillotson College in Austin during the Great Depression. Walter Binger advised the trustees to choose Branch because Travis was a champion of slavery and a poor role model for kids since he'd left his pregnant wife and kid behind to come to Texas. He described Travis as, quote, a ne'er-do-well who in 2 weeks' time happened to do something wonderful, end quote. Yes, dying at the Alamo sort of was the pinnacle of Travis's career and rather eclipses any unproven, tawdry parts of his personal life. I haven't a problem in the world with naming a school after such a woman of achievement, but the tearing down of Travis seems, well, petty here. I don't require purity or piety in my historical figures, and I'd argue that it's their flaws that make their lives relatable to us in the first place. Moving on to 1990. In that year, Binger wrote a new foreword to a reprint of Rebellious Ranger, William J. Hughes's 1964 biography of Rip Ford. In that foreword, Binger tells us that the book is good because Hughes was a pretty good storyteller and that Ford's life was a rousing tale. Then Binger gives a brief description of Hughes's career and says that because Hughes was heavily influenced by people like Walter Prescott Webb and J. Frank Dobie, quote, it is not surprising that Rebellious Ranger glorifies the Texas Rangers. The book also accepts or downplays Ford's racism and violence, ignores women, and treats Indians, Mexicans, and blacks paternalistically. In the foreword, Binger continues, quote, for some, this is reason enough to let the book continue to reside on the back shelf. In another sense, however, the work is useful exactly because of these characteristics. Vietnam, the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Movement, and the onslaught of new social history all swept away this kind of history, end quote. Fact check, false. There are still books published that show us the flawed norms of the 1960s or even the 1860s without including a diversity statement in the prefatory material. They allow the reader to determine what was good and what was bad from those men and those times. They just aren't published by university presses. The mid-century sensibilities with which Hughes treated the Rangers, women, and minority groups, Binger says, give the book a, quote, certain antique quality that reminds us of the change in the study of American history, end quote. He's trying to say Hughes's book is a relic of a bygone time, but at no point does he tell us if Hughes's research is sound or meritorious. The purpose of the foreword seems to be this. University of Oklahoma Press wanted to reissue a 1964 book for which there was a large audience, us Texans, but needed to kiss the ring of the burgeoning PC culture of 1990 as penance for selling a book with outdated norms in its pages. Quote, it should also remind historians that in another 25 years, their well-honed work and up-to-date attitudes will probably be regarded as having antique characteristics, end quote. Well, it's been 31 years since Binger wrote this preface, and attitudes within his bubble are still in vogue and have escaped the cloister of academia into broader society. June 15, 1992, from the San Bernardino County Sun. There was a kerfuffle within the firefighters union. Some firemen wanted to use a leather helmet called the Sam Houston because it was produced in Houston. Others protested, alleging Houston was a slave trader and responsible for atrocities against Mexican women and children. When contacted for comment, Binger, then a professor at Texas A&M, remarked that Houston was ousted as governor of Texas because he opposed secession in 1861. Quote, I think people should pick somebody else to body slam. For his time and even for ours, Houston was a fairly authentic hero, end quote. Not to nitpick or anything, but a huge chunk of Binger's professional writing happens to be on Texas secession. Viewed through a secession-centric lens, Houston can be deemed a hero for being on, God, I hate this phrase, wait for it, the right side of history. Binger omits the fact of Sam Houston's slaveholder status, which is an automatic disqualifier for hero status in today's academic world. But 1992 wasn't now. So we need to give credit where it's due and give Binger the win on this one. March 2nd, 2009. The Fort Worth Telegram carried a story about Texas Independence Day and the Declaration. Binger provided his view on the meaning of the founding document of the Republic. Quote, back then, the document served to rally support for the cause, and it articulated the reasons they were fighting, or at least the reasons they wanted the world to see and believe. It was part propaganda, part inspiration, and part a statement of belief and values. End quote. Quote, Texans make Texas history, and Texas Independence Day serves the purpose of making them feel exceptional and distinct from the rest of the country. End quote. Amazing how he can read the minds of 30 plus million people and know why they care about a thing. This type of mind reading and psychoanalysis and judgment is completely antithetical to the title professional historian. June 28, 2015, in the Bryan Eagle. In an article that quoted some A&M professors discussing Confederate imagery, Binger reminds us that one document, the Texas Declaration of Independence, is not to be taken at face value, while another that suits his preferred historical narrative should be. From the article, quote, Walter Binger, an A&M history professor who specializes in Texas and the South, said that every state that published a reason for seceding said it was about perpetuating slavery. He said the official document outlining the reason for Texas's secession stated that the end of slavery would bring desolation upon the 15 slaveholding states. The reality, he said, is that slavery was quite profitable, or it would have been abandoned long before 1865. End quote. The reality is that in all industries then and now, some business concerns become profitable and others become mired in debt, as the extant ledgers of many planters prove. In reality, slave labor wasn't free labor. Slaves had to be purchased, then fed, then clothed and housed. Demand for slaves and the fruits of their hard labor fluctuated. Basic economics at work. Weather likewise fluctuated. Mother Nature at work. The blanket assertion, and it is a very popular one now, that slavery was quite profitable is both historically and economically inaccurate. And now let's move on to 2017. June 9th, 2017 to be exact. In a KVUE ABC story about Confederate monuments and their history, Binger, being quoted as chief historian of TSHA, said of the county, schools, statues, etc., quote, almost all the naming and statue building came out of an attempt to remake the history of the Civil War, and after about 1885 to make it into something which it wasn't, for the sake of politics of the post-1885 time. He further said there was a period in Texas during the late 19th century through early 20th where tributes to Confederate icons were commonplace, but then Texan eyes drifted back towards Texas history. Quote, probably by about 1920, people began to turn away from Confederate statues and Confederate commemorations back toward Texas, because Texas, they could say, won, and the Confederacy lost. Regardless of where you stand on what's to be done with Confederate monuments today, the absurd SPLC view that they were all built during a particular time to suppress a particular group of people is just that. It's reductive and absurd. History is complicated, and monument building was complicated too. As for the idea that Texans kicked the Confederacy to the curb to run back into the waiting arms of Texas history after 1920, that's patently false, and it's easily refuted. Texans across the state, for example, celebrated San Jacinto Day long before the Battle of Flowers Parade or Fiesta were things, and certainly before 1920. There were orations, 21-gun salutes, picnics, barbecues, fundraising events for a San Jacinto monument, and after 1874, it was a state holiday, replete with school and business closures. Turns out Texans cared about Texas history before and beyond Binger's 1920 benchmark. Moving on to August 18, 2017. The Austin CBS News affiliate did a story on the controversial Children of the Confederacy Creed plaque that used to hang in the Texas Capitol building. Binger billed in the article as the head of the Texas State Historical Association, flexed his clairvoyant skills again, looking deep into the minds of the people of 1959 who hung the plaque. Quote, "It most likely reflects something about resistance to Brown versus Board of Education and the end of a Jim Crow system." End quote. Professor Binger believes it's time the plaque came down. Quote, "It's wrong. Take it down and put it in a museum." End quote. In my mind, it reflected exactly what the plaque said it meant, that the children of the Confederacy wanted to honor their ancestors and the version of history they wanted to perpetuate. I don't agree with that version of history, but I also don't think mind reading is necessary to glean the plaque's intent. And now we move on to 2018. September 8th, 2018, the Washington Post and others carried the story that a State Board of Education work group suggested revisions to the Texas 7th grade curriculum standards, among them removing the word heroic as a descriptor for the Alamo defenders. Because he's TSHA's chief historian, Walter Binger was called upon by the Washington Post for comment. And he did. He said that if we avoid describing the defenders as heroic, the teachers could, quote, revitalize the complexities of not only the battle, but Texas history itself, end quote. He pointed out incorrectly that the defenders were acting in defiance of Sam Houston's orders by remaining at the Alamo. This is, of course, factually incorrect. The chief historian of TSHA is telling a common misconception. While Houston did suggest to Bowie that it might be the best course of action to abandon the Alamo and blow it up, he had no authority to give such an order till he was made commander-in-chief of all Texas forces on March the 2nd, which was 9 days into the Alamo siege. Until that point, the only man in Texas with the authority to give such an order was Provisional Governor Henry Smith. Back to the article. Quote, "In some minds, the defenders were not heroic, but vainglorious, foolish, and counterproductive." End quote. You probably saw this coming, but just in case you didn't, I'm going to let you in on a little secret, okay? According to academics, we only revere the Alamo because racism. Quoting the Washington Post article, "The battle was only revered decades after the building itself was used by the Army as a storage depot a decade after the battle. By the early 20th century, as Hispanic immigration rose, the Alamo was cast as a good and evil struggle with whites on one side and Mexicans on the other," Binger said. "But people of Mexican descent also fought for the Texan cause at the Alamo," Binger said, a fact that has been cast aside since the racist depiction of Mexicans in the 1915 movie Martyrs of the Alamo. In case you're wondering how we went from analyzing the word heroic straight to the guy who made Birth of a Nation, academia is the only answer I can give you. That was the shot. Here is the chaser. Intense focus on the Alamo in curriculum has perplexed Binger and others. Binger agrees there's too much curriculum focus on certain aspects of the Alamo, but says there's also too much about the fight for independence itself. Many classes pay less attention to events after the Civil War, he said. Texas has a lot of history after that, and it's worth studying, he said. If knowing that TSHA's chief historian thinks we teach too much revolution has your hackles up, then you're in the right mind for this next piece. The October 2019 edition of Texas Monthly, a huge story titled "The Battle to Rewrite Texas History." Naturally, Binger was consulted, and naturally he did his thing. He said that in the 1990s, back when he co-authored the plan to bring new social history to our schools, he was optimistic that traditional history was dead. Alas, it was still kicking. And why? White supremacy is why. For what it's worth, white supremacy is Binger's answer to nearly every question. He described traditional history that appeals to the public as, quote, white men on horseback and an emphasis on politics, the military, and the 19th century. I mean, there were some pretty interesting white dudes whose primary means of locomotion was horseback. But Walter takes us for simpletons who don't appreciate the prowess of the Comanche warrior or the Tejanos who fought in the Revolution. Does he think we're all stuck in the John Wayne Alamo until some credentialed gatekeeper teaches us to know better? And now we circle back to white supremacy. Binger tells us why the public still buys books about the Alamo and the Texas Rangers. Quote, "The old history is useful to reinforce social status and undergird political ideology. It undergirds white supremacy." The simplified version of that is, if you don't embrace this new social history, you're a white supremacist. I reckon that holds true for Black Texans who read traditional history or Latino kids who find heroism in the Alamo story. Stands to reason, right? But wait, there's more. Binger went on to say that people get desperate when times are tough and they turn to history. He cites Fehrenbach's Lone Star as an example and hypothesizes, quote, I've always suspected that, in a way, that book was written to push back against the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the student movement, end quote. He mentions that interest in Texas history also spiked from 1890 to 1920 when there was mass migration from Mexico. Quote, that's when we started celebrating the Alamo, which had practically been falling down until then, end quote. So, Binger claims most Confederate monuments were built in the same period to keep Black people in line, that Texas history caught on because of fear of Mexican immigration, and that Fehrenbach wrote a book because of the civil rights movement. Do you see a pattern? While it is factually untrue that Texans didn't start celebrating the Alamo until 1890, it is more ridiculous psychoanalysis and mind reading to state that the reasons Texans began paying attention to it was because of Mexican immigration. Anyone possessed of a basic knowledge of Texas history knows the Alamo wasn't exactly in great repair in 1836. Adina de Zavala began the fight to consolidate and preserve the Alamo in the early 1890s. I'd like to hear Walter tell me with a straight face that Adina de Zavala was a white supremacist panicked over Mexican immigration. The courts determined that the Alamo belonged to the Catholic diocese, and they didn't begin selling off chunks of it until the 1870s. They didn't part with the Alamo Church until 1885. The point being that while the Alamo was remembered well before 1890, it just wasn't a unified place that could be preserved by the city or the state until the 1890s. So, remember 2020? Yeah, I hate to take you back there, but that's where we're headed. June 9th, 2020, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram ran a sensational headline about Tammy Nakamura, a Colleyville City Councilwoman who was posing with the Confederate flag at a rally. She posted this photo, along with about 40 others, in an album on her personal Facebook account. You'll recall summer of 2020 as a turbulent time of riots and looting after video surfaced of a man dying in police custody in Minneapolis. Walter Binger, described in this article as having, quote, researched the Confederacy and historical usage of the flag, and is the Summerlee Foundation Chair in Texas History at the University of Texas, commented as follows. The flag, as it has been used historically, is clearly anti-African American and anti-desegregation and anti-civil rights. And to post it now is incredibly insensitive. It's just appalling. No matter what you believe, to do it now is to intentionally hurt people, to intentionally inflame the situation, given what it has traditionally stood for. Historians should instinctively seek context, but Binger and the newspaper didn't seek any here. As it turns out, Mrs. Nakamura was standing next to a man in a wheelchair. On the left side of his chair, he had placed an American flag. On the right, he had affixed a Confederate flag. So she stood next to a disabled guy with two flags attached to his wheelchair, took a photo, then uploaded a bunch of pictures to Facebook. Would that Walter Binger had looked for context before impugning the motives of someone I imagine is a stranger to him. The photo remains on Facebook, as it likely should, and the Star-Telegram story with Binger's remarks intact remains uncorrected. July 28, 2020. An article on Historynet.com about how history can get political. Please note the illustration above the fold is an engraving of the, quote, storming of the Alamo. Now, we all make typos, but come on, man. Anyway, the illustration includes the latter-day hump in the facade. The caption illustrates Binger's point that the Alamo had a flat roof at the time of the battle. More on that in a minute. Let's just grab a couple of highlights from this piece before we move on. Historynet asks, have you ever caught flack for your viewpoints? And Binger answers, quote, I always catch flack. One example, I often say that in 1836, the Alamo had a flat roof. That fancy top was added a decade later, and that's a metaphor for understanding the Texas Revolution and much of Texas history. It's been added on after the fact. The average student's or average non-historian's knowledge of Texas and U.S. history is heavily influenced by what someone wants to believe or what their ideology, status, or uncritical reading encourages them to believe. I take students, and all who will listen, back to 1836 and alert them to the dangers of listening to what was added on after the fact. The chief historian should catch flack for such remarks, but not because of the bad analogy. Has TSHA's chief historian never seen a rendering of the Alamo before the hump was added? Does the endowed chair in Texas history at UT not know the Alamo Church had no roof in 1836? The average non-historian with the slightest bit of curiosity has this rudimentary knowledge, and Walter Binger apparently does not. In the same piece, Historynet asks Binger, when everyone has a version of the truth, can educators hope to engender consensus on America's history? And Walter Binger responds, quote, I'm not especially optimistic that history can escape being a casualty of the culture wars, especially given the radical right's general disdain for expertise in any field. All I can do is suggest that historians stay humble, avoid treating those who seem wrong-headed with disdain, and try to stress the need for a past-forward approach. If we can simply get across the concept that many people are looking at the past from the wrong end of the telescope, I could justify a smidgen of optimism. A note to the chief historian, labeling those who read traditional history as white supremacists is hardly humble and seems pretty disdainful to me. So here we are in 2021. On January 12th, USA Today published an article that attempted to tie a visit from President Trump to the town of Alamo, Texas, to the Alamo. Chief historian Binger went full-blown crazy and tied everything together. He lumped the Alamo in with Confederate monuments and racism in a spectacle of intellectual acrobatics that may well melt your mind. From the article. Like the Confederate monuments erected after the Civil War, the myth of the Alamo has been used to, quote, commemorate whiteness, end quote, according to Walter Binger, Texas State Historical Association chair. The battle itself was relatively insignificant, tactically speaking, but it gained recognition decades later in the 1890s as backlash to African Americans gaining more political power and Mexican immigration increasing, Binger said. In 1915, Birth of a Nation director D.W. Griffith produced Martyrs of the Alamo, which solidified the myth further by pitting white, virtuous Texans against racist caricatures of Mexicans on screen. Quote, it became, in some ways, a sort of symbol of Anglo-Saxon preeminence. The Alamo became this symbol of what it meant to be white. So not heroism or victory or death or a final stand, just, a symbol of whiteness. Binger said that Trump, by going to the town of Alamo, was likely trying to invoke the myth of the battle without acknowledging the involvement of Mexican Americans. Quote, he wants to sort of tap into this theme of the Alamo as a defining moment in American history and the triumph of Anglo-Saxon civilization and the move west. It is, again, tapping into a defense of white privilege. So there you go, fellow Texans, your chief historian of the Texas State Historical Association, the man who controls what information people learn about Texas history, both in our state classrooms and all over the world. A representative of the association has said Binger's comments don't reflect TSHA's views. I wonder how they square that circle considering their bylaws show the chief historian is involved in darn near every decision made for the organization. If you think you noticed a crescendo in his rhetoric after 2017, after he hit the academic jackpot with the endowed chair and chief historian status, you're not wrong. And Walter Binger isn't alone. He's just a symptom, albeit a very powerful one, of a much bigger problem. Almost every university in Texas is staffed by his fellow travelers. So the elephant in the room, what everyone's saying under their breath is, how did this happen? How did I not know? I think the answer is because of our values and our belief in our fellow Texans, we've all watched what's happened across the country and wishfully assumed it wasn't happening here, that nobody would touch our history with that corrosive brush because if anybody did, there would be a fight. We continued to look at our mild-mannered TSHA as benevolent and on the side of all Texans. We assumed that what was being done in good faith. And nobody wants to say it out loud, but I will. From the very top, the foundations who give millions to fund TSHA, to the average hardworking Texan, none of us were being watchful. I wasn't being watchful. I didn't think I had to be. We know better now, and it's not too late to change course. Many of you have asked with despair in your voices, what can I do? Is it too late? Is our history lost? No, it isn't lost. There's a lot we can do and a lot we will do to make things right. Friends of Texas are coming together to show that you can't, in 30 years, kill what has been alive in the hearts of Texans for 185. Until the next installment, God in Texas, y'all.